boy just returned from death with a final warning from Jesus. The shrill beeping of medical machines pierces through my fading consciousness. Through half-closed eyes, I see the fluorescent lights of the emergency room streaming past overhead as they rush me down the corridor. I'm only 4, but I know something is terribly wrong. The pain in my stomach is unbearable, like nothing I've ever felt before. BP dropping. We're losing him. A doctor's voice echoes somewhere above me. Please God, not my boy. That's my dad's voice, my strong, unwavering father who never shows fear in front of his congregation. But now I hear it breaking, desperate. Todd, they need you to sign the consent forms now. Mom's voice trembles as she grips Dad's arm. The world starts to fade, turning darker at the edges. I try to reach for Mom's hand, but my arms won't move. Through the chaos, I hear Dr. O'Halloran's urgent voice. His appendix has ruptured. The infection is spreading. We need to operate immediately. But the mortality rate, another voice starts. We don't have a choice. Dr. O'Halloran cuts in. Every minute we wait. The last thing I see is Dad, my pastor father, falling to his knees in the hospital hallway, his hands clasped in desperate prayer. Mom is crying, something I've never seen before. The medical team is shouting numbers and medical terms I don't understand. Everything feels distant now, like I'm floating away from my own body. Jesus, please. Dad's prayer fades as darkness closes in. Then suddenly everything stops. The pain vanishes. The beeping silences. The chaos disappears. And I find myself somewhere else entirely, somewhere beautiful and peaceful, where a warm, loving light surrounds me. What happens next would change not just my life, but the lives of everyone around me forever. If you've been captivated by this extraordinary journey between life and death, this glimpse into the divine, don't let this moment slip away. Subscribe now to unlock more profound stories that will forever change how you see our world. Before that fateful day in the emergency room, life in Imperial, Nebraska was everything a 4-year-old could dream of. Our family wasn't wealthy, but we were rich in the things that mattered. Dad, Todd Burpa, was the pastor at Crossroads Wesleyan Church, a man whose faith could move mountains and whose smile could light up the darkest room. Every Sunday I'd watch him from the front pew, mesmerized by how he could touch people's hearts with just his words and unwavering belief in God's love. Mom, Sunja, was my safe harbor. A music teacher at the local school, she had this way of making everything better with just a hug. Her voice, whether singing hymns in church or reading bedtime stories, had this magical quality that made me feel protected from all the world's troubles. And then there was my sister Cassie, 2 years older than me, always trying to boss me around, but also fiercely protective of her little brother. Our house wasn't fancy, just a modest pastor's home on Maple Street, with a creaky porch swing where Dad would tell us stories about Jesus after dinner. The garden out back was Mom's pride and joy, full of flowers that seemed to dance in the Nebraska wind. It was where I spent countless hours playing, imagining adventures while Dad worked on his sermons in his study and Mom graded music papers on the porch. Life had a comfortable rhythm back then. Sundays were for church, where I'd sit fidgeting in my small suit while watching Dad preach. Wednesdays were for youth group, where Mom would lead the children's choir. Saturdays were for family time, picnics in summer, board games in winter. The congregation was our extended family, always there for potluck dinners, prayers, and celebrations. But there was something else about our family that nobody talked about, a shadow of sadness that I didn't understand then. Years before I was born, Mom and Dad had lost a baby, a little girl who never got to take her first breath. They never mentioned her, but sometimes I'd catch Mom looking at empty spaces as if seeing someone who wasn't there. I didn't know then how important this hidden grief would become in our story. Dad was more than just our pastor. He was also a volunteer firefighter and high school wrestling coach. Everyone in Imperial knew Todd Burpa not just as the man who delivered sermons on Sundays, but as someone who'd drop everything to help a neighbor in need. His faith wasn't just words, it was action, lived out every day in the way he cared for our community of 2,000 souls. Our life wasn't perfect, but it was blessed. The church members would bring casseroles when Mom was too busy with music recitals to cook. The local farmers would invite us to their harvest celebrations. Even the town skeptics respected Dad for his genuine care for everyone, regardless of their beliefs. Looking back now, I realize how those early years shaped everything that was to come. The foundation of faith, family, and community that surrounded me would be tested in ways none of us could have imagined. But that's what makes this story more than just another tale of a small-town pastor's family. It's about how the deepest truths can come from the most unexpected places, and how sometimes it takes a child's eyes to see what adults might miss. Little did we know that our ordinary life in Imperial, Nebraska was about to become extraordinary in ways that would challenge not just our family's faith, but the beliefs of people around the world. And it would all begin with a pain in my stomach that seemed at first like nothing more than a typical childhood ailment. The morning of my first public speaking event at church, just 2 weeks before everything changed, captures perfectly how intertwined our lives were with the community. Dad had decided I was old enough to read a Bible verse during the children's service, and it seemed like all of Imperial had turned up to watch Pastor Todd's little boy take his first steps in following his father's path. Our church wasn't just a building on Main Street, it was the heartbeat of our community. Every pew held a story. Mrs. Anderson, who'd lost her husband last spring but never missed a service, the Thompson twins, my best friends from Sunday school, old Mr. Jenkins, who claimed to be an atheist but came every week, because Todd's sermons make me think each face represented connections that went far deeper than casual acquaintance. Dad's role as pastor extended far beyond Sunday sermons. I remember the night the Petersons' barn caught fire. Dad was first on the scene in his firefighter gear, then spent the next day organizing the congregation to help rebuild. Or the time he sat for 3 days straight with the Williams family while their teenage son was in surgery after a farming accident. He wasn't just preaching about God's love, he was living it. Our home was never truly quiet. People would show up at all hours, couples seeking marriage counseling, teenagers struggling with faith, families dealing with loss. Mom somehow managed to make everyone feel welcome, always ready with fresh coffee and her famous apple pie. She had this way of making even strangers feel like family. I watched Dad navigate the delicate balance of being both spiritual leader and friend to his congregation. He knew when to be the authoritative voice of guidance and when to simply be a shoulder to cry on. Even as a child, I sensed the weight of responsibility he carried. Each person's pain became his pain, their joys his joys. The skeptics in town, and there were quite a few, respected Dad because he never pushed his beliefs on anyone. Dr. Miller, our town's most vocal atheist, once told me years later that he trusted Dad more than any religious person he'd ever met, because your father cares about people first and preaching second. Even when faced with criticism or doubt, Dad remained unwavering in his faith while showing nothing but love to those who disagreed. Our family's reputation in Imperial was built on these relationships. We weren't put on a pedestal. Small towns don't allow for that kind of pretense, but people knew they could count on the Burpus. Whether it was Mom organizing music for the town's Christmas festival or Dad performing emergency baptisms at the hospital, we were woven into the fabric of community life. Looking back, I realize now how this deep connection to our community would become crucial in the events that were about to unfold. The trust that had been built over years of shared lives, the genuine relationships that transcended religious differences, the way our family had become part of the town's story, all of it would be tested and ultimately strengthened by what happened to me. That morning at church, when I finished reading my Bible verse, John 3:16, Dad said, "Start with the classics." The congregation burst into applause. Not because a 4-year-old had done anything particularly spectacular, but because they were genuinely invested in our family's journey. They were our extended family, our support system, our witnesses to both ordinary moments and extraordinary ones. None of us knew then how soon they would all be called upon to put their faith and support into action. The bonds that had been forged through years of shared life in our small town were about to face their greatest test. But that's the thing about small towns like Imperial. When crisis hits, the whole community becomes one family regardless of their beliefs or backgrounds. It started on a Wednesday morning, seemingly ordinary like any other. I woke up with a slight stomach ache, nothing unusual for a 4-year-old who'd probably eaten too many cookies at Mrs. Thompson's house after Sunday school. Mom gave me some children's Tylenol and sent me to preschool thinking it would pass, but something felt different this time, a deep, gnawing pain that made it hard to concentrate on finger painting and story time. By lunchtime, my teacher, Miss Sarah, noticed I wasn't my usual energetic self. I couldn't eat my peanut butter sandwich, and the mere sight of food made my stomach churn. "He's been holding his side and crying," she told Mom when she came to pick me up early. I remember the worry lines appearing on Mom's forehead, the same ones she got when Dad was out late on emergency fire calls. That night, the pain got worse. I curled up in my parents' bed, something I hadn't done since I was 3. The Tylenol wasn't helping anymore. Mom's cool hand on my forehead confirmed what she feared I was burning up. 103.2, she read from the thermometer, exchanging worried glances with Dad. Still, they tried to stay calm, not wanting to frighten me or Cassie, who kept peeking in from the hallway with concerned eyes. Thursday brought no relief. The local clinic diagnosed it as stomach flu, prescribing rest and fluids. But by evening, I couldn't keep anything down, not even the flat ginger ale that Mom swore by. The pain in my side had become unbearable, and I remember crying out in the middle of the night, "Daddy, make it stop." For the first time in my life, I saw fear in my father's eyes, the kind of fear that even his strongest prayers couldn't mask. Friday morning, I was worse. My skin had taken on a greenish tinge, and the pain had moved to my right side. Mom, usually so composed, was frantically calling Dr. O'Halloran at home. "Something's not right," I heard her say, her voice trembling. "He's not responding to anything, and his skin, it doesn't look right." The next few hours became a blur of increasing pain and confusion. I remember Dad carrying me to the car, my body feeling like it was on fire. Cassie was left with the Thompsons, crying as we pulled out of the driveway. The usually hour-long drive to the bigger hospital in North Platte seemed to take forever. Every bump in the road sent waves of agony through my small body. I drifted in and out of consciousness during the journey. In my lucid moments, I caught fragments of my parents' whispered conversations. Should have brought him in sooner. God, please. What if we're too late? The fear in their voices was palpable, thick enough to cut through even my fever-induced haze. Dad, who always obeyed speed limits to set a good example for his congregation, was pushing our old Subaru to its limits. Mom kept reaching back to check on me, her hand cool against my burning skin. I wanted to tell her I was okay, to ease the worry in her eyes, but the words wouldn't come. The pain had become my entire world. Looking back now, I understand why that Wednesday morning marked the beginning of something far bigger than just a case of severe appendicitis. It was the start of a journey that would test not just my body, but my family's faith, our community's bonds, and everything we thought we knew about life, death, and what lies beyond. None of us knew then that these seemingly routine symptoms were about to spiral into a crisis that would shake our family to its core and eventually touch lives far beyond our small Nebraska town. As we raced toward North Platte Regional Hospital that Friday morning, we were also racing toward a divine appointment, one that would forever change not just my life, but the lives of countless others. The emergency room at North Platte Regional was chaos when we arrived. I remember the automatic doors sliding open, the sharp smell of antiseptic, and Mom's voice rising with urgency as she explained my symptoms to the triage nurse. "His fever's been climbing. Severe abdominal pain. Local doctor said stomach flu, but something's wrong." The first doctor who examined me, Dr. Thompson, no relation to our church Thompsons, seemed frustrated by my inability to pinpoint exactly where it hurt. Everything hurt now. His initial diagnosis echoed what we'd heard before, probably a severe case of gastroenteritis. I caught the doubt in Dad's eyes, the same look he got when someone in his congregation wasn't telling the whole truth. "With all due respect," Dr. Dad's pastor voice came through, firm but polite, "this isn't stomach flu. Something's seriously wrong with my son." I'd never heard him challenge authority like that before. Mom was gripping his hand so tight her knuckles were white. The monitors I was hooked up to kept beeping faster, matching my racing heart. Then came the moment that would haunt my parents' dreams for years to come. As Dr. Thompson was explaining why more tests weren't necessary, I started convulsing. The room erupted into motion. "Code blue!" someone shouted. Mom was pushed aside as medical staff swarmed around my bed. Through my fading consciousness, I heard snippets of panic temperature 105.4. BP crashing. Possible sepsis. Dr. O'Halloran arrived, then a blessing in surgical scrubs. She'd been in surgery but came running when she heard the Burpa boy was crashing. One look at my rigid abdomen and she knew. This boy's appendix has ruptured. The previous diagnosis was wrong. We need an OR now. Her words cut through the chaos like a lighthouse beam through fog. The next moments were a blur of papers being thrust at my parents' consent forms with terrifying mortality rates and complications listed in cold medical terms. Mom, the English teacher who read everything thoroughly, couldn't even focus on the words. Dad's hand shook as he signed, something I'd never seen before or since. Pastor Burpa Dr. O'Halloran pulled my parents aside, her voice gentle but urgent. I need you to understand Colton's condition is critical. The infection has likely spread throughout his abdomen. We'll do everything we can, but... She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. That's when I saw something I'll never forget, my strong, faithful father breaking down. The man who confidently spoke to hundreds every Sunday, who comforted grieving families and counseled troubled souls, collapsed into a chair, his face in his hands. Mom was frozen, staring at me as if memorizing every detail of my face. Through the haze of pain and fever, I heard Dad's prayer, raw and desperate. Lord, please don't take my son. It wasn't his public prayer voice. This was a father bargaining with God, each word torn from the depths of his soul. Mom joined him, their hands clasped together over my bed as the staff prepared to rush me to surgery. The last thing I remember before they put the mask over my face was Mom singing softly, her voice breaking, Jesus loves me. This I know, the same lullaby she'd sung to me every night since I was born. I tried to squeeze her hand to tell her I wasn't scared anymore, but my body wouldn't respond. As the anesthesia took hold, I felt myself floating away from the fear, the pain, and the desperate prayers of my parents. I didn't know then that I was about to experience something that would change not just my life, but the lives of everyone who would hear my story. What waited for me beyond that operating room would challenge everything we thought we knew about faith, death, and the power of a child's truth. The first surgery didn't go as planned. Through the fog of post-operative consciousness, I heard Dr. O'Halloran explaining to my parents that they'd found far more damage than expected. The infection had spread everywhere, turning my insides into what she called a toxic soup. But that wasn't the worst part. We've lost his pulse again, a nurse's voice cut through the recovery room's relative quiet. I was floating somewhere between darkness and light, aware of my body below me as medical staff rushed around it. The monitors were screaming their electronic warnings, and through it all, I could see Mom and Dad pressed against the observation window, their faces masks of terror. Starting chest compressions, another voice called out. I watched with strange detachment as they worked on my small body. The scene was chaotic, yet seemed to move in slow motion. Dr. O'Halloran's normally composed face showed strain as she barked orders, push one of EPI. Where's that crash cart? From my elevated vantage point, I could see everything clearly now. Mom sliding down the wall in tears, Dad holding her while his lips moved in desperate prayer, the medical team's increasingly frantic efforts. What they couldn't see was that I felt no pain anymore. Instead, there was a warm, peaceful feeling drawing me upward. The next few minutes would later be described in the medical records as multiple cardiac events, but that clinical language couldn't capture what was really happening. While my body lay there, my consciousness was experiencing something extraordinary. A soft light began to fill my awareness, growing brighter but never hurting my eyes. Time of arrest, 3:02 p.m., someone announced. But I was barely paying attention to him anymore. Something else was happening, something beautiful and terrifying and impossible to fully describe. The hospital room began to fade away, replaced by colors I'd never seen before, and a sense of love so powerful it seemed to encompass everything. Down below, they were still fighting for my life. Dr. O'Halloran refused to give up, even when other staff members began exchanging knowing looks. "Come on, Colton," she muttered between compressions, "your story's not finished yet." She had no idea how right she was, though not in the way she meant. That's when the first miracle happened. Just as the medical team was about to call my time of death, my heart suddenly started beating again. But something was different now. While my body was showing signs of life, my consciousness was somewhere else entirely, somewhere that would challenge everything my pastor father had ever preached about. "We've got a rhythm," the words echoed distantly, as if from the bottom of a deep well. The medical staff's relief was palpable, but they didn't know that while they were celebrating getting me back, I was actually embarking on an incredible journey. A journey that would later make some people question their beliefs, strengthen others' faith, and spark debates that would reach far beyond our small Nebraska town. I learned later that during those critical minutes, Dad had made a desperate promise. Standing outside the recovery room, watching his son die and come back, he pledged that if God would spare me, he would never question how I described what happened during those moments, no matter how impossible it seemed. The next 24 hours were touch and go. My body was fighting the massive infection, while my spirit was experiencing things that my 4-year-old mind could barely comprehend. The medical team worked tirelessly, pumping me full of antibiotics, monitoring every slight change, and preparing for the possibility that they might lose me again. Through it all, I kept drifting between two realities: the harsh clinical world of the hospital and somewhere else, somewhere that would change everything we thought we knew about life, death, and what lies beyond. But the full magnitude of what was happening wouldn't become clear until much later, when I finally found the words to describe what I'd experienced during those critical hours. What none of us knew then was that this was just the beginning. The real turning point, the moment that would shake our family's faith to its core and then rebuild it stronger than ever, was still to come. Because what I saw during those hours when I hovered between life and death would challenge not just our beliefs, but the very nature of what we think is possible. That's when everything changed. While my physical body lay in the recovery room, monitored by machines and surrounded by worried medical staff, I found myself somewhere else entirely. The pain that had been my constant companion for days suddenly vanished, replaced by a peace so profound it defied description. The harsh hospital lights faded away, and I was enveloped in a radiance that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The first person I saw wasn't a doctor or a nurse, it was Jesus. Not the Jesus from the stained glass windows in our church or the paintings in my Sunday school books, but real and alive and more present than anyone I'd ever met. His eyes held a love so intense it would have been overwhelming if it wasn't also so gentle. He smiled at me, and in that smile was every answer to every question I'd ever had or would have. "Don't be afraid, Colton," he said, his voice both powerful and tender. "You're safe here," and I was. For the first time since this ordeal began, I felt completely, perfectly safe. He reached out his hand, and I saw the mark where the nail had been, not a painful wound anymore, but a symbol of love that took my breath away. Then I saw her, a little girl who ran up to me with the biggest smile I'd ever seen. Somehow I knew immediately who she was, even though we'd never met on Earth. "I'm your sister," she said, hugging me. The one who died in Mommy's tummy. No one had ever told me about her, but here she was, perfectly real and alive, telling me she couldn't wait to meet our parents when it was their time. Pop was there too, Dad's grandfather, who died long before I was born. He looked exactly like the young man in the black and white photo Mom keeps in our family album, except his eyes were bright with life and joy. He told me about watching over Dad, about being there for moments our family thought he'd missed. The colors in this place were unlike anything I'd ever seen on Earth. Some of them I can't even describe because we don't have words for them. Music filled the air, but not from any visible source. It was as if the very atmosphere was made of melody, each note perfectly complementing the next in a symphony of praise. Angels were everywhere, their wings catching light in ways that made them seem to glow from within. They sang songs I'd never heard but somehow knew by heart. One of them, with kind eyes and a sword that shimmered like lightning, told me things about the future, things I wouldn't understand or remember clearly until years later. Time didn't work the same way there. In what felt like both an instant and an eternity, I learned more about love, faith, and the nature of reality than all the sermons I'd ever heard. Jesus showed me things, glimpses of heaven, that would later make my father, the pastor who thought he knew all about such matters, question everything he'd ever preached. But then came the moment of choice. Jesus looked at me with those eyes that held all the love in the universe and said, "You have to go back, Colton. It's not your time yet." Part of me wanted to stay, who wouldn't? But I understood somehow that I had a purpose to fulfill, a story to tell. Just before I felt myself being drawn back to my body, Jesus shared one last message, words meant not just for me, but for everyone who would later hear my story. It was a message about love, about faith, and about the reality of things we can't see but are more real than the world we think we know. The return was gentler than the departure. As I drifted back, I heard the beeping of machines again, felt the pain beginning to return, and heard Mom's voice singing softly. But I was different now. How could I not be? I had seen beyond the veil that separates our world from the next, and nothing would ever look the same again. When I fully regained consciousness, I found myself back in the hospital room, surrounded by relieved medical staff and my tearful parents. They had no idea where I'd been, what I'd seen. How could I, a 4-year-old boy, possibly explain to them that while they were praying desperately for my life, I had been walking in heaven? The story that would unfold from this moment would test my family's faith, challenge our church's beliefs, and touch lives around the world. But for now, I was just a little boy waking up from what everyone thought was just a close call with death. Only I knew it had been so much more. The weeks following my surgery were filled with small victories and puzzling moments. At first, my parents were just grateful I was alive, too relieved to notice anything different about their 4-year-old son. But as my strength returned, things started happening that they couldn't easily explain away. It began one quiet afternoon during my recovery at home. Mom was sitting beside my bed reading me stories like she always did when I interrupted her mid-sentence. "Mommy, you know I saw her there, right?" The way her hand froze on the page told me something had shifted in the room's atmosphere. "Saw who, honey?" she asked, trying to keep her voice casual. "My sister. The one you lost before she was born," I said it matter-of-factly, the way kids do when they're stating something obvious. Mom's face went pale. She and Dad had never told me about the miscarriage. How could they explain such a complex loss to a young child? But there I was, describing a girl who looked just like Cassie but with Dad's dark hair. She told me it's okay, I continued, not realizing the impact my words were having. She said she can't wait to meet you, but not yet because it's not your time. Mom's book slipped from her hands, landing with a soft thud on the bedroom floor. I can still remember the mix of shock, wonder, and something else, fear maybe, in her eyes. That was just the beginning. During my recovery, I started saying things that made the adults around me exchange worried glances. I described Pop Dad's grandfather in perfect detail, down to the way he laughed and the funny way he walked. But that's impossible, I overheard Dad telling Mom late one night. "Those photos of Pop are all packed away in the attic. Colton's never seen them." The medical staff who visited for follow-up care noticed it too. During one checkup, I told Dr. O'Halloran about watching her work on me from above the operating table. I described details of the surgery that no unconscious child could have known: the color of her hairnet, the unusual birthmark on the nurse's neck, the exact words she'd said when my heart stopped beating. My innocent comments about heaven began to shake my father's carefully constructed theological framework. As a pastor, he'd spent years studying Scripture, preaching about the afterlife, and counseling grieving families. But here was his son, barely out of preschool, describing things that aligned perfectly with biblical descriptions he'd never shared with me, yet adding details no one had ever considered. One evening, as Mom was tucking me in, I asked her why she couldn't see the angels that were still hanging around my room. "They've been here since I got back," I explained, pointing to corners that looked empty to her. "They make sure I'm safe and help me not be scared when the pain gets bad." Mom sat on the edge of my bed for a long time after that, her hand stroking my hair, her thoughts clearly somewhere far away. The hardest part for my parents wasn't just dealing with these revelations, it was deciding how to respond to them. Dad struggled with his dual roles as my father and as a pastor. His theological training told him to be cautious about claims of supernatural experiences, but his heart knew his son wasn't making this up. Mom, always the practical one, found herself caught between maternal instinct and impossible truths. As my physical healing progressed, the memories of my experience remained crystal clear, unlike normal 4-year-old memories that tend to fade. I could still see Jesus' face, feel the overwhelming love that surrounded me in heaven, and remember conversations with people I'd never met on earth. These weren't like dreams that dissolve upon waking, they were more real than anything I'd experienced in my young life. Our small Nebraska community began to notice changes too. Word spread, as it does in small towns, about Pastor Burpo's son and his remarkable stories. Some brought casseroles and offered support, others kept their distance, unsure how to handle claims that challenged their comfortable assumptions about life and death. The turning point came during a family dinner about 6 weeks after my surgery. We were saying grace, a normal part of our routine, when I suddenly stopped mid-prayer. "Daddy," I said, looking straight at him, "you know that's where I saw you, right? In that little room at the hospital when Jesus was holding me. You were praying and Mommy was on the phone." I described exactly what they'd been doing during my surgery in 2 different rooms, at the same time details I couldn't possibly have known. That was the moment my parents knew they had to start taking my experience seriously. This wasn't just a child's imagination or medication-induced dreams. Something profound had happened during those critical hours when I hovered between life and death, something that would change not just our family but countless lives in the years to come. It was during a quiet Sunday afternoon about 2 months after my surgery when I first really began to share what I'd seen of Jesus. We were sitting in the living room, the Nebraska sun casting long shadows through the windows, when Dad asked me what I remembered about being in the hospital. What came out wasn't just a child's memory of doctors and nurses. "Jesus has pretty eyes," I said simply, coloring in my Sunday school book. Dad's coffee cup froze halfway to his mouth. His eyes are sort of greenish blue, like the color of the sky when a storm is coming, but they're filled with so much love it almost hurts to look at them. The detail in my description made both my parents exchange glances. This wasn't the Jesus from my picture books or the church windows. I went on to describe things that made Dad, with all his years of theological training, sit up and take notice. I talked about the marks in Jesus' hands and feet, not like the gruesome images from church, but more like badges of love. He showed them to me, I explained, and told me that's how much he loves everyone. It didn't hurt anymore, but he said he keeps them to remember. The throne room I described matched biblical accounts my 4-year-old self had never read. God's throne is really big, I said matter-of-factly, and there are colors there that we don't have here. Jesus sits on the right side of his Father, just like you say in church, Daddy. Dad nearly dropped his Bible when I mentioned that detail. It was straight from Scripture, but not something I'd been taught yet. My descriptions of heaven challenged everything my parents thought they knew. I talked about how time didn't work the same way there, how you could know things without being told, and how love was like the air everyone breathed. Nobody's old in heaven, I explained, and nobody wears glasses, but everybody can see everything perfectly. The angels I described weren't the chubby cherubs from greeting cards. They're really tall, I said, stretching my arms up high, and their wings are so big. Some have swords that flash like lightning. When Dad asked if they were scary, I laughed. No, they're beautiful. And they sang to me all the time. The music in heaven never stops. It's like it comes from everywhere at once. Perhaps most convincing to my skeptical parents were the small, specific details I kept mentioning. Things like how Jesus' sash was purple, royal purple, I insisted, though I'd never heard that term, or how the gates of heaven were made of a material that seemed to be alive with light. These weren't details from any children's Bible story. I remember the evening I told them about meeting John the Baptist. "He's really nice," I said over dinner. "He still talks about baptizing Jesus. He says it was his best day Mom dropped her fork." Dad started asking me questions about what John looked like, and my answers matched historical descriptions I couldn't have known about. The most powerful moments were when I talked about God's love. It's bigger than the whole world, I tried to explain. When God looks at you, you feel like you're the most important person ever. And Jesus told me to tell everyone that he really, really, really loves them. My simple words brought tears to Mom's eyes. As the weeks went by, my memories didn't fade like normal childhood memories do. Instead, they seemed to become clearer, more detailed. I began to remember conversations, messages that seemed meant not just for me, but for others. Jesus said people need to know that heaven is real, I told Dad one night. He said lots of people are scared about what happens after they die, but they don't need to be. Some things I shared made my parents uncomfortable, not because they didn't believe me, but because the theological implications were staggering. I talked about seeing the Holy Spirit like a blue light that makes you feel happy, and described powers and principalities that matched advanced biblical concepts. How could a 4-year-old know these things? The more I shared, the more my parents realized we were dealing with something extraordinary. This wasn't just a child's near-death experience or a vivid imagination. The consistency of my stories, the theological accuracy of details I couldn't have known, and the profound impact my words had on those who heard them suggested something far more significant was unfolding. The real climax of my story began to unfold about 3 months after my surgery, during a seemingly ordinary moment at the breakfast table. As Mom was pouring my cereal, I suddenly looked up and said something that made her hand tremble, spilling milk across the table. "Mommy, in heaven, I met the baby you lost." She told me she couldn't wait to meet you properly someday. The words hung in the air like visible things. Mom sank into her chair, white-faced. This wasn't just another childhood fantasy. I was describing her deepest, most private loss, something she and Dad had never discussed with me or Cassie. She looks like Cassie, I continued, oblivious to the impact of my words, but her hair is darker, like Daddy's. She hugged me and said she was okay. Tears were streaming down Mom's face now. Later, she would tell others that this was the moment she knew beyond any doubt that my experience was real. No one had ever told me about her miscarriage, yet here I was, describing a sister I'd never met on Earth. The details poured out of me with increasing clarity over the following days. I described meeting Pop, Dad's grandfather, as a young man, not the elderly figure in the one photo I'd supposedly never seen. He has really big hands, I said, and his laugh sounds like Daddy's. I went on to describe exactly how he would hold his coffee cup with 3 fingers, a quirk no one had ever mentioned to me. One evening, while Dad was preparing his Sunday sermon, I walked into his study and made an observation that would shake his theological foundation. "Daddy, you know there are no old people in heaven," I said casually. "Everyone's young and healthy. Even people who were old or sick when they died, they're all perfect there." This aligned perfectly with biblical teaching, but added details no one had ever considered. The most profound revelations came when I described my time with Jesus. His clothes are white, but not like regular white, I explained, struggling to find the right words. "It's like they're made of light itself." I described how he would lift children onto his lap, just like the Bible story, but with details no artist had ever captured. His eyes, I said, they're like looking into forever, but they're so full of love you're not scared at all. Perhaps the most startling revelation came during a thunderstorm. While other kids my age were frightened by the lightning, I watched it with fascination. The angels' swords look like that, I said matter-of-factly, but prettier. And they used them in the battle. When Dad asked what battle, my response left him speechless. I described a coming conflict between good and evil, with details that eerily matched the book of Revelation, a text I couldn't possibly have read or understood. I spoke about colors that don't exist on Earth, music that doesn't just enter through your ears but fills your entire being, and a sense of peace that makes all earthly contentment seem pale by comparison. In heaven, I explained, you can feel God's love like sunshine on your face, but all over and inside too. The markers on Jesus' hands and feet became a particularly moving topic. Unlike the graphic depictions in church, I described them as beautiful badges of honor rather than wounds. He let me touch them, I said quietly one evening. They don't hurt anymore, but he keeps them to show how much he loves us. This perspective on Christ's sacrifice brought tears to my father's eyes. I revealed knowledge of biblical events I couldn't have known about. Jesus still has the rainbow throne in heaven, I mentioned casually, describing something only found in the book of Revelation. And there are lots of children there. Jesus said he especially loves children because they believe without making things complicated. My descriptions began to attract attention beyond our family. When word spread through our small town, people started asking questions. Some were skeptical, but their doubt often turned to wonder when I would share details about their deceased loved ones, things I couldn't possibly have known. Your grandmother, I told Mrs. Anderson after church one Sunday, says she loves the roses you plant at her grave, but she can see much prettier ones here. The most profound revelations about my heavenly encounters came in waves, often triggered by the most mundane moments. One Sunday afternoon, while Mom was flipping through our old family photo album, I pointed to a photo I'd supposedly never seen before. "That's what Pop looks like in heaven now," I said casually, except his smile is bigger and he doesn't have those wrinkles around his eyes anymore. Mom froze, her finger hovering over the yellowed photograph. This particular image had been stored in the attic for years, taken when Pop was in his 30s, decades before I was born. Yet I described him perfectly, down to the way his left eye crinkled more than his right when he smiled. He showed me his favorite fishing spot, I continued, the one where he used to take Daddy when he was little. He says Daddy never mentions that anymore. Dad's hands began to shake when I mentioned this. He later confessed that those fishing trips were some of his most treasured memories, but he'd never spoken about them to anyone, not even Mom. The spot was a secret place along the river that only he and Pop had known about. Then came the most heart-wrenching revelation about my sister. "She doesn't have a name," I said one evening during dinner. She said she can't wait for Mommy and Daddy to give her one. The fork slipped from Mom's hand, clattering against her plate. They had indeed never named their lost baby, something they'd regretted for years, but had never discussed with anyone. I described how my sister would run up to hug me in heaven, her dark hair flying behind her. She's not a baby there, I explained. She's a little bit bigger than me, and she can talk and everything. She told me she just has to wait a little while longer to meet everyone. Mom left the table in tears, but they weren't entirely tears of sadness. There was healing in them too. The details about other family members were equally specific and impossible for me to have known. I talked about meeting Dad's Uncle Wayne, who died in a car accident before I was born. He wants you to know he wasn't scared, I told Dad. He says he saw Jesus right away and it was okay. Dad had struggled with his uncle's sudden death for years, wondering if he had suffered or been afraid. One of the most powerful moments came when I described meeting Mom's grandfather, who had died when she was just 12. He watches you teach music, I said to her. He says he's proud that you still play the piano he bought you. Mom gasped. She had never told anyone that her first piano had been a gift from her grandfather, a fact she'd kept as a private memory. These weren't vague, general statements that could apply to anyone. They were specific, detailed accounts that often included private family moments or secrets. I described conversations with relatives about events that had happened decades ago, sharing intimate details that only they could have known. Great-Grandma Martha wants you to know she found her locket, I told Mom one day. The one she was looking for before she died. It fell behind the dresser in the bedroom. Mom had to sit down. Her grandmother had indeed spent her last days distressed about a missing family locket, something that had never been found after her death. The impact of these revelations extended beyond just our immediate family. During a church potluck, I approached Mrs. Wilson, whose son had died in Vietnam. Tommy says the last letter made it, I said innocently. He was able to read it before the accident. Mrs. Wilson burst into tears. She had always wondered if her final letter to her son had reached him before his death. These encounters weren't scary or sad. They were filled with joy and peace. I described how everyone in heaven seemed to know each other, how families were reunited, how all the pain and grief of earth was transformed into something beautiful. Nobody's mad at anybody in heaven, I explained. All the bad stuff just doesn't matter anymore. Perhaps most remarkably, these descriptions matched perfectly with Scripture, yet included details that even biblical scholars had never considered. When Dad would gently test my accounts against his theological knowledge, he found no contradictions, only deeper insights that enhanced his understanding of biblical truths. The first signs of trouble emerged during a Wednesday evening church service. As Dad shared some of my experiences from the pulpit, hoping to bring comfort to his congregation, I noticed Mr. Thompson, our head deacon, shaking his head with obvious disapproval. After the service, I overheard him telling others, "Pastor Todd is letting grief cloud his judgment. Children make up stories all the time." Things escalated quickly after that. Our small Nebraska town suddenly seemed divided into two camps: those who believed my account of heaven and those who thought I was either lying or that my parents were exploiting my near-death experience. The weekly prayer group that had met in our home for years suddenly had several empty chairs. Dr. Miller, our town's most prominent physician, published a letter in the local paper suggesting that my visions were likely the result of anesthesia and trauma. While we sympathize with the Burpa family's ordeal, he wrote, "It's irresponsible to present a child's medication-induced hallucinations as spiritual truth." His words cut deep, especially since he'd been a friend of our family for years. The criticism wasn't just local. When a regional newspaper picked up the story, religious scholars from nearby universities began weighing in. Some questioned how a 4-year-old could possibly comprehend, let alone describe, complex theological concepts. Others suggested my parents were coaching me, using my innocent voice to promote their own religious agenda. The hardest part was watching how it affected Mom and Dad. Dad would spend hours in his study, wrestling with his dual role as my father and as a pastor responsible for his congregation's spiritual well-being. Mom stopped volunteering at my school after overhearing other parents whisper about that poor Burpa boy and his attention-seeking parents. Even Cassie felt the impact at school. My sister, who had always been popular, found herself eating lunch alone more often. Some kids say their parents told them not to play with us anymore, she told Mom one evening, trying to hide her tears. They say we're weird now. The church board called a special meeting to discuss the situation. I wasn't supposed to know about it, but I could hear their voices through the heating vent in my room. They were concerned about the church's reputation, about the growing divide in the congregation, about the potential loss of members and funding. Some suggested Dad should take a leave of absence until things settled down. What hurt most was seeing how some people treated my experiences as entertainment rather than truth. Local news reporters started showing up at our house, asking for interviews, wanting me to perform like a circus act. "Tell us about the angels again, little boy," they'd say, their voices dripping with condescension. When Dad refused their requests, they painted us as secretive and uncooperative. The medical community's response was particularly harsh. Dr. O'Halloran, who had saved my life, found her professional judgment questioned by colleagues. How could she support what they called this religious fantasy? Even though she maintained that something extraordinary had happened during my surgery, the pressure eventually led her to distance herself from our family. But the deepest wound came from within our own church family. People who had known me since birth, who had prayed for my recovery, now looked at me with suspicion or pity. Some suggested that Dad was using me to write a book or get speaking engagements. Others implied that Mom's grief over her miscarriage had somehow influenced me to make up stories about meeting my unborn sister. The strain on our family reached its breaking point one stormy October evening. Mom had just received a letter from her closest friend, Sarah, who wrote that she could no longer maintain their friendship. "I can't support what you're doing to Colton," the letter read. "Making him believe these things, using him to gain attention, it's not right." Mom collapsed into tears at the kitchen table, the letter crumpling in her trembling hands. Dad's faith, once as solid as the Nebraska bedrock, began showing cracks. I caught him late one night in his study, head in his hands, surrounded by open Bibles and theological texts. "Lord," he whispered, not knowing I was watching, "if this is real, why does it feel like everything is falling apart?" His sermons, once confident and inspiring, became cautious and defensive, as if he was constantly trying to justify not just my experience, but his entire belief system. Cassie started having nightmares. "What if you're wrong?" she asked me one night, crawling into my bed during a thunderstorm. "What if heaven isn't real, and you just dreamed it all?" The doubt in my sister's voice hurt more than any skeptic's criticism. She had always been my strongest defender, but now even she was wavering. My own struggles were different, but equally painful. The memories of heaven remained crystal clear: the colors, the music, Jesus' face, my sister's embrace, but finding words to describe them became increasingly difficult. How could I explain colors that don't exist on earth? How could I make people understand the kind of love I had experienced? Each failed attempt to convey the truth left me feeling more isolated. The pressure began affecting my health. The doctors noticed my blood pressure rising during checkups, unusual for a child my age. I started having anxiety attacks, especially in crowds or at church where I could feel people staring and whispering. The peaceful certainty I had brought back from heaven was being eroded by earthly doubt and fear. One Sunday, I overheard two elderly church members discussing my situation after service. "It's a shame," one said. "Such a sweet boy, but clearly troubled, and his poor parents enabling this fantasy." Something inside me snapped. I ran to the front of the church and climbed onto the pulpit, something I'd never dared do before. "Jesus is real," I shouted, my voice echoing through the nearly empty sanctuary. "Heaven is real. Why won't you believe me?" My outburst shocked everyone, especially myself. Mom rushed to pull me down, but the damage was done. The next day, the church board called another emergency meeting. The worst moment came when a child psychiatrist suggested that my experiences might be a form of coping mechanism, a way to deal with the trauma of my near-death experience. "It's common for children to create elaborate fantasies," she explained to my parents, as if I wasn't sitting right there. The best thing might be to discourage discussion of these visions. Dad started receiving anonymous letters from congregation members, suggesting that his leadership was compromised by his support of my delusions. Some demanded his resignation. Others recommended counseling for all of us. The church we had called home for years no longer felt safe or welcoming. Even our home life became strained. We stopped having family dinners, each of us retreating to separate corners of the house to deal with our pain alone. The laughter and warmth that had once filled our home was replaced by a heavy silence, broken only by hushed conversations and muffled crying. The turning point in our family's crisis came from an unexpected source. Mrs. Anderson, who'd lost her entire family in a car accident years ago, came to our house one rainy Tuesday evening. Her hands were shaking as she pulled out an old, sealed envelope from her purse. This letter, she said, her voice trembling, was written by my husband the night before the accident. I've never opened it. Never showed it to anyone. She turned to me, her eyes filled with tears. Colton, last Sunday you told me something about my family in heaven. You mentioned that my husband wanted me to open his last letter. How did you know about this? The room fell silent. I remembered meeting her family in heaven, remembered her husband's specific message, but I'd never understood its significance until now. With shaking hands, Mrs. Anderson opened the envelope. Inside was a letter that confirmed everything I had told her, details about their private lives, their last conversation, and even a secret only she and her husband had known. This was just the beginning. Over the next few weeks, more validations emerged. Mr. Jenkins, our town's most vocal skeptic, arrived at our door one evening with an old photograph. You mentioned my mother's red hair, he said gruffly. All existing photos of her are in black and white. No one alive knew she had red hair. His hands trembled as he showed us the recently discovered color photograph that proved my description correct. Then came the incident with Dr. Miller, the physician who had publicly dismissed my experience. During a chance encounter at the grocery store, I told him about his daughter who had died in infancy, decades before I was born. I described her white dress with tiny purple flowers, the one she was buried in. Dr. Miller's face went pale. He had never told anyone about that dress, not even his wife. It had been his private goodbye to his little girl. Perhaps the most compelling validation came through Dad's own research. As a pastor, he had access to ancient theological texts, and he began finding obscure descriptions of heaven that matched my account exactly, details so specific and unusual that they had never been included in any children's Bible story or Sunday school lesson. One particularly striking confirmation came when I described the position of Jesus' throne in relation to God the Father's, a detail that matched an ancient Hebrew text Dad had never studied. The Son sits at the right hand, but slightly forward. I had said, describing exactly what scholars had debated for centuries but few had ever written about. The medical records from my surgery provided another layer of verification. Dr. O'Halloran had documented several inexplicable moments during my operation, times when I should have died but somehow didn't. More importantly, I was able to describe conversations and events that happened in different parts of the hospital while I was supposedly unconscious, details that were later verified by multiple witnesses. Local newspaper archives revealed another startling validation. I had described a man in heaven who had died in a train accident in our town in the 1920s. Research confirmed every detail of my account, down to the color of his pocket watch, information that wasn't included in any published reports. These validations created a ripple effect in our community. People who had been skeptical began to question their doubts. The evidence was becoming too specific, too accurate to dismiss as coincidence or imagination. How could a 4-year-old know these things? How could anyone know these things unless they had actually experienced them? The most compelling evidence came during a church service that none of us will ever forget. A visiting family had slipped into the back pew, parents with 3 children and an elderly grandmother. I had never seen them before, but halfway through Dad's sermon, I suddenly stood up and walked directly to him. "Your baby is okay," I said to the mother, whose face went white with shock. "The one you lost last month. She's with my sister in heaven." The woman burst into tears. No one in our town had known about her recent miscarriage. They were just passing through Nebraska on their way to Colorado. But I went on to describe her unborn daughter in detail, including the name she had chosen but never shared with anyone. That same day, I provided details about historical events that left historians speechless. I described the inside of ancient Jerusalem's temple with perfect accuracy, including architectural details that had only recently been discovered through archaeological digs. Jesus showed me where he used to teach, I explained casually, proceeding to describe a specific corner of the temple that archaeologists had just unearthed. During a quiet moment at home, I started speaking about the Great Depression, sharing specific details about our town during that era. Pop showed me, I said, describing how the drought had affected our family's farm. Dad later verified these details through old county records information that wasn't even in our local historical society's archives. The most extraordinary validation came through my descriptions of people's deceased loved ones. I wasn't just sharing vague, comforting messages, I was providing specific details about private moments, unspoken words, and unresolved relationships. Information that only the deceased person could have known. One evening, I told our neighbor about her father's hidden letter in the old barn wall, a message he had written to her before his death but never had the chance to share. When they checked, they found it exactly where I said it would be, sealed and untouched for 20 years. Medical professionals were particularly stunned when I accurately described surgical procedures and medical equipment I had never seen while conscious. Dr. O'Halloran brought in specialists who verified that my descriptions of the operating room matched perfectly with what would have been happening during my surgery, including conversations and events that occurred while I was clinically dead. Perhaps the most convincing evidence came through my knowledge of languages I had never learned. During a visit from a Korean missionary, I repeated words I had heard in heaven, perfect Korean phrases that carried deep spiritual meaning. The missionary was shocked not just by my pronunciation, but by the profound theological concepts these ancient phrases conveyed. The mathematical precision of my descriptions also defied explanation. I spoke about distances in heaven, describing them in terms that exactly matched biblical measurements, complex calculations that scholars had debated for centuries. How could a 4-year-old understand, let alone articulate, such precise mathematical and architectural concepts? These revelations continued to unfold, each one more inexplicable than the last. The evidence was becoming impossible to dismiss, forcing even the staunchest skeptics to reconsider their position. Something extraordinary had happened during those moments when I hovered between life and death, something that defied ordinary explanation. The transformation in our community began gradually, like a sunrise spreading across the Nebraska plains. What started as a story about a little boy's journey to heaven had become something much more profound, a catalyst for healing and renewed faith that touched lives far beyond our small town. Mrs. Anderson, once consumed by grief over her lost family, found peace through the specific messages I shared from her loved ones. She started a grief support group at our church, helping others process their losses with a new perspective on life after death. The room that once held skeptical church board meetings now overflowed with people seeking hope and understanding. Dr. Miller, perhaps the most remarkable transformation, went from being our biggest skeptic to one of our strongest supporters. After receiving undeniable proof about his deceased daughter, he began sharing his own story of how my revelations had healed decades of hidden grief. His medical credentials lent credibility to our story, but it was his personal testimony that moved people most deeply. Our church, which had nearly split apart during the initial controversy, experienced a renewal that surprised everyone. The pews that had emptied during the darkest days were now filled beyond capacity. People drove from neighboring states to attend services, drawn not by spectacle but by the simple truth that flowed through our congregation's renewed spirit. The impact on our family was equally profound. Dad's sermons took on a new dimension, blending theological knowledge with the simple yet powerful truths I had brought back from heaven. Mom found healing for her long-buried grief about her miscarriage, now able to talk openly about the daughter she would one day meet. Cassie, my sister, developed a depth of faith unusual for someone her age, helping other children understand death and heaven without fear. But perhaps the most significant change was in how our community dealt with death and loss. Funerals at our church became different, still sad, but tinged with a tangible hope. When I would share specific messages from departed loved ones, it wasn't just comfort I was offering, it was evidence of a continuing connection that transcended death. The final message from my heavenly experience wasn't just about proving life after death, it was about transforming how we live our lives here and now. Jesus had told me something crucial: Colton, tell them that heaven is real, but also tell them that how they live on earth matters more than they know. In the years since my journey to heaven, I've watched this message change lives in ways I never could have imagined. The woman who had lost all hope after her son's death found purpose in starting a children's charity. The businessman who had focused only on wealth discovered joy in using his resources to help others. The angry teenager who had felt abandoned by God found peace in understanding that his deceased mother was watching over him. Our family learned that truth, when shared with love and supported by undeniable evidence, has the power to break through the strongest walls of doubt. Dad often says that my experience didn't just change what he believed about heaven, it changed how he lived on earth. Mom found a new ministry helping women cope with miscarriage and infant loss, turning her own pain into a source of healing for others. The message continues to ripple outward. People who hear our story often say it's not just the proof of heaven that moves them, it's the realization that every moment of life has eternal significance. The kindness we show, the love we share, the choices we make, all of it matters more than we realize. Perhaps the most beautiful outcome has been watching how people's understanding of death has transformed. It's no longer seen as an ending, but as a transition, a going home. As one elderly church member said before passing, "I'm not afraid anymore. Now I know it's real, and they're waiting for me." Looking back on that critical time in the hospital, I realized that my journey to heaven wasn't just for me. It was a gift meant to be shared, a light meant to pierce the darkness of doubt and fear. The final message is simple yet profound. Heaven is more real and more beautiful than we can imagine, and love is the bridge that connects us to it, both here and there. So many people ask me if I'm ever afraid of death now. My answer is always the same: how can you be afraid of going home? That's what heaven is, our real home, where every tear is wiped away, every question answered, and every broken heart made whole. And until we get there, we have work to do here, sharing love, spreading hope, and living in ways that matter for eternity. If this story of faith, hope, and the reality of heaven has touched your heart, we invite you to share your thoughts in the comments below. Has a similar experience touched your life? Do you have questions about what lies beyond? Your story matters to our community. Support our mission of sharing these profound messages by subscribing to our channel and hitting the like button. Each subscription helps us reach more souls seeking answers and hope. Share this video with loved ones who might need this message of comfort and assurance. Together we can spread the truth about heaven's reality and God's endless love. Join our growing family of believers and seekers by engaging with our content. Your support makes these stories possible.